oceans of tears, but the love is still in the air. Going fast while heading nowhere, but we believe we'll make it there. Now we're here, ready to race to the moon. Now we're here, ready to race to the moon. We fight till we fall on the way. We don't care if we lose it all. We build our castle of sand till the waves come and wipe it off. Battling in oceans of tears, but the love is still in the air. Going fast while heading nowhere, but we believe we make it there. Now we're here, ready to race to the moon. Now we're here, ready to race to the Think about the times when we were young. Now look at the people we become. Tonight I understand you're not my enemy, no. Lying in the bed right next to you, making me forget what I've been through. Now I can see the light. This is unbreakable. We survive every war, 'cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. We fight it over like way back in. I find you couldn't melt these stars here. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. We fight it over like way back in. I find you couldn't melt these stars here. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. We fight it over like way back in. I find you couldn't melt these stars here. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. We fight it over like way back in. I find you couldn't melt these stars here. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. We fight it over like way back in. I find you couldn't melt these stars here. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I 'Cause we're indestructible. You and I, you and I, you and I. Been fighting all my life without getting. I fire couldn't melt this heart of steel. This is unbreakable. You and I, you and I, you and I. We're unbreakable. We're unbreakable. Lying in the bed right next to you, making me forget what I've been through. Now I can see the light. This is unbreakable. We survive every war. 'cause life is still a mystery. She couldn't believe why I waste my time on this. Bullshit mentality isn't a thing that I would miss. But I still remember those days when we used to kiss on a lazy afternoon. Cigarettes and bottles of wine, living easy, I presume. Now I can't stop wondering why you have to be so cold, frozen like ice. It's time for me to really adore your new disguise. The blood is rushing through my veins when we play that game, although it's the same thing every time. You are frozen like ice. Baby, why'd you have to be so cold? She said she couldn't believe why I waste my time on this. Bullshit mentality isn't a thing that I would miss. Now I can't stop wondering why you have to be so cold, frozen like ice. It's time for me to really adore your new disguise. The blood is rushing through my veins when we play that game, although it's the same thing every time. You are frozen like ice. Baby, why'd you have to be so cold?
If you could be more, if you could be all that you adore, if you could be far away from here, if you had what it takes, would you run until it
won't stop the noise that's inside my head. A voice that keep telling me things, horrible things about you. And I remember what they used to say. You should count to 10. And then you take a deep breath and run out of things to say. But I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then I start a little war. Yeah, I start a little war. Do you ever feel the same? That you too can hear a voice that keep telling you things, horrible things about me. But I don't want to play this game no more. I've run out of cards to play, and so I smash a plate against the wall and scream while you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. If you know how to stop the noise that's inside our heads, please don't stop telling us things, horrible things about counting to 10 again and again, always the same. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before.
you close your eyes? Do you feel alive? Do you know I'm going crazy for you tonight? Summer's around the corner. I want this night to be over. Summer's around the corner. How can we make this last forever? Make this by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. I got my eyes on you, and you got no clue what I'm supposed to do. I can't help myself. Little by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. Take was not yours. If you know who I am, when the night will fall, I'll haunt your dream. Little by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. Complete.
here she comes. Why do I turn into a shoegazer? Wise up, buy her a cup, and just once be a trailblazer. So I do, I even get her too. Well, make sure she takes it her new friend. Let's meet again. When do I pretend to be cool when my heart is racing? It's 10 seconds of courage. It's a brief moment of faith, and so with your heart out, go on and on about your money and your fancy cars. You give it your best shot, throw in all you got. It's just a waste of time. She's with me. Spotlight feels alright, flying higher than a Wayne mankind. She smiles and penguin miles. For love you would walk 1,000 miles. Just a brief 10 seconds, hope and gust. So leave your heart out, go on and on about your money and your fancy cars. You give it your best shot, throw in all you got. It's just a waste of time. 'Cause she's
back off, don't go near me. I surrender, 'cause I can take no more. Hear my last goodbye. I am running towards the end of time at the speed of light. Can't take one more fight. All the feelings that I have inside make me lose my mind. But it feels so good, though it hurts so bad. I could drug you and drive me crazy. Hear my last goodbye. I am running towards the end of time at the speed of light. Change. You want me to change. Lost in a land of confusion. This is more than I can take. Wish we could stay unbroken. One moment, one reason. After all, our hearts kept on bleeding. We just can't deny it. Forced to tears, face the fear of losing you. I want you to see this is more than a lie. You want me to think that I can do much better. Stop making a scene, because there is no turning back. So please don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Stop making a scene, because there is no turning back. So please don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridges. Don't burn down the bridge. I don't know you anymore. It's been a long time since I did. Something is tearing us apart. I don't know what it is, so please just let me know where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will go. I don't know about you, babe, but I just wanna know what you've been up to lately. You seem to avoid me. Don't think you can keep messing with my heart. Are we gonna be alright? Please just let me know where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will go. Where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure.
for us to make it through the night. Stormy weather, weary eyes, hope to make it through the night. Before this night is over, I will guide you home. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life. I've been told that time will heal all our wounds and our sorrows too. No more clouds, no more rain. I need sun to ease my pain. Before this night is over, I will guide you home. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life.
Yeah. I don't wanna be the girl, but I kinda need a word. Well, I'm into you. And oh, I know it's been a long time. I was on the sideline waiting for you. We could go to California or anywhere you wanna. As long as I'm with you, I'm alright. And we don't need the drama. We'll find our own nirvana. So run away with me tonight. 'Cause it feels like I'm dreaming when I'm waking up next to you. And my world wander on nirvana, so run away with me tonight. 'Cause it feels like I'm dreaming when I'm waking up next to you, and my wild heart is beating because it's beating next to you. Let's find something better to hold on to, 'cause we can do anything we want to, and I can't help the feeling that I get when I'm next to you. Will you run away? Will you run away with me? 'Cause I will run away, I will run away with you. Will you run away? Will you run away with me? 'Cause I will run away, I will run away. 'Cause it feels like I'm dreaming when I'm waking up next to you, and my wild heart is beating because it's beating next to you. Let's find something better to hold on to, 'cause we can do anything we want to, and I can't help the feeling that I get when I'm next to you, when I'm next to you. On my own, but I'm never alone. On a road to wherever I want. And you see, I go with the wind, the places I've been, I keep them within, holding on to a feeling so strong. On my own, on my own, I made it all
storm is raging in your head, when you feel there's nothing more ahead, the hills they seem all green but they hide all the monsters, and you kept holding my hand as you reached for water. The hills by the lake, you were chasing your dream, and I gave you a rose that you kept on seeing, kept on seeing. It was worth the fight. When the stars glow bright, the summer's old. In the misty bright moonlight, I were told, when the storm is raging in your head, when you feel there's nothing more ahead, the hills they seem all green but they hide all the monsters, and you kept holding my hand as you reached for water. The hills by the lake, you were chasing your dream, and I gave you a rose that you kept on seeing, kept on seeing. For so long, you kept going on, and for every tear you shed, for everyone you love, the hills are
Do you feel like you got broken into pieces by someone that you love? You love. Do you feel like you were waiting for the part when life will open the door? The door. There's a silver light at the end of the tunnel. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to you. Just let it come to you. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to you. Just let it come to you. When you feel like you have lost it, there's a treasure sitting inside of you. When you're holding on to nothing, you can find it. There's a glow in the dark. The dark. There's a silver light at the end of the tunnel.
finish it all. And if you're in the dark, just let it come to ya. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya.
Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. What all my friends said still echoes in my head. We would make the cutest couple. I didn't know you were playing, and I'm just saying you gotta weigh in. This is not something to die for. You turn your back on me, so I turn my back on you. And now we're stuck in this charade. I don't know what to do. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. You played it cool, played me for a fool, so cruel. It sure was time for a wake up. And now that I'm over it, someone's gotta pay for it. You should know I still remember every word you said. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Still the same. Oh, let me carry you. Still on my brain. I hope you feel it too. Still the same. Oh, let me carry you. Still on my brain. I hope you feel it too. You turn your back on me, so I turn my back on you. And now we're stuck in this charade. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, baby. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late.
Captured in a photograph. Remember how we used to sit in the vines? Yeah, oh. And I can hear you laugh it off. You always said mistakes I left in the past. But no, I know enough to see the glow on us break over. Sooner than we're gone. And sometimes I think about it all night, staring to the streetlights, wonder where we'd be if nothing would have changed. We'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame. Would we hold our ground if nothing would have changed? Would you take my name, stay here through the rain? from another time. Big walls of paint that spells out your name. Yeah. You said you had to change your heart, that Albany just left you all the same. Find you in another time. Up it comes and down it goes. Seeds will die before they grow. If nothing were to change, we'd have stayed the same. Never killed the flame. Would we hold our ground? If nothing were to change, would you take my name? Stay here through the rain. Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Photograph. Do you remember how we used to sit in the vines?
It's like a dream when we both get together and feel. Yeah, my mind
I'm sick of walking this dog. It's like I live in a fog. Tonight I want something new. I feel the need to get rude. I'm tired of watching the tube. Oh, God, I need some fast relief. So, hey, baby, please, now won't you tell me you feel the same and you want someone to turn it all around and let you freak. Now it's on. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Get my dirty freak on tonight. My dirty freak on. A funny taste in my mouth. I wake up dead on the couch with the sun in my eyes. And so I go lay down on the floor, 'cause I can't take it no more. Seems like I've been here before. Oh, God, I need some fast relief. Like 3 stacks of pancakes and a day of TV. And I'm already ready to go and be gone. So come on, bring the heat and let me know that it's on. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Let's go, let's go, let's go all
I see a train moving all too fast, but I'm not leaving. And you go round and round and round, and you cannot see. I'll be right behind you, walking the tree. You look so beautiful today, and now the game is changing. Just like a stranger suddenly knows everything. Stakes are higher than you know.
Well, what would you do? Would you play the game? Talking like everything still is the same. Something else to believe, a reason to be. I had a wish in my hand when I learned to be free, a reason for me. If you were lonely, I'd like to be lonely with you. If you feel cold, I will build you a fire in the soil for you. I do it for you. For you. I do it for you. If you were lonely, I'd like to be lonely with you. If you feel cold, I will build you a fire in the soil for you. Will I ever feel this light again? When I thought I didn't need it, I found a new friend. I'll wake you tomorrow before I leave, and the song I'll be singing will be this one indeed. This is as long as we go. I know you will be alright. But somehow wherever you are, you're still in the crossfire. I will give you the world if you let me stay. Put your arms around me. If we stay here like this is the only place where I wanna be. This is as long as we go. I know you will be alright. But somehow wherever you are, you're still in the crossfire. And the chemical ghost, it will hunt you down. And you know you're gonna fall when you hit the ground. There's nothing
wish that I could stay. Wish for this moment to never go away. But it's all in my mind. And though I know that there is nothing to find, you're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light. See how you've grown while you roam in the streets all alone. And all you can see, thinking about what your life came to be. You're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light. Another day, like the mothers of Brazil find their way. We're all on our own, but you're the most beautiful I've ever known. You're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light. play, 'cause life is still a mystery.
She couldn't believe why I waste my time on this. Bullshit mentality isn't a thing that I would miss. But I still remember those days when we used to kiss on a lazy afternoon. Cigarettes and bottles of wine, living easy, I presume. Now I can't stop wondering why you have to be so cold, frozen like ice. It's hard for me to really adore your new disguise. The blood is rushing through my veins when we play that game, although it's the same thing every time. You are frozen like ice. Baby, why'd you have to be so cold? She said she couldn't believe why I waste my time on this. Bullshit mentality isn't a thing that I would miss. Now I can't stop wondering why you have to be so cold, frozen like ice. It's hard for me to really adore your new disguise. The blood is rushing through my veins when we play that game, although it's the same thing every time. You are frozen like ice. Baby, why'd you have to be so cold?
If you could be more, if you could be all that you adore, if you could be far away from here, if you had what it takes, stop the noise that's inside my head. A voice that keep telling me things, horrible things about you. And I remember what they used to say. You should count to 10, and then you take a deep breath and run out of things to say. But I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then I start a little war. Yeah, I start a little war. Do you ever feel the same? That you too can hear a voice that keep telling you things, horrible things about me. But I don't wanna play this game no more. I've run out of cards to play, so I smash a plate against the wall and scream while you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. If you know how to stop the noise that's inside our heads, please don't. And stop telling us things, horrible things about counting to 10 again and again, always the same. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before. Yeah, you start a little war. Same way as before.
you close your eyes? Do you feel alive? Do you know I'm going crazy for you tonight? Summer's around the corner. I want this night to be over. Summer's around the corner. How can we make this go on forever? Make this forever?
Little by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. I got my eyes on you, and you got no clue what I'm supposed to do. I can't help myself. Little by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. No, you wouldn't take what's not yours. If you know who I am, when the night will fall, I'll haunt your dreams. Little by little, piece by piece, I take back what's been stolen from me. Little by little, piece by piece, until I'm complete. It'll never be over completely.
nothing for me in this world, but there I stood and I was done, done, done. You and I know what goes around comes around, so now I'm gonna tear you down, down, down. With you, my love was a loaded gun, so now you better run. Fire at will. I am a cannonball shooting through the air, so come on, be still and fire at will. I keep a steady march, and my heart beats like a drum. Come on, be still and fire at will. Give me your best shot, fire at will. Give me your best shot, fire at will. I found a strength in me that's about to be released. Hard like you're going down, down, down. No matter what you say, no matter what you do, there's no way back, we're going down in flames. I'm afraid this masquerade is over. I have you in my sights, so fire at will. I am a cannonball shooting through the air, so come on, be still and fire at will. I gave you all the best, you ripped my heart through the chest. Come on, be still and fire at will. Give me your best shot, fire at will. Give me your best shot, fire at will. Fire at will. I am a cannonball shooting through the air, so come on, be still and fire at will. I keep a steady march, and my heart beats like a drum. Come on, be still and fire at will. Give me your best shot, 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 fire at will. Ooh, I'm falling like a hit fly down to your feet, crawling on my knees. I face the concrete, taste the blood in my mouth, but I don't really care. Oh no, I'm wasted like a Sunday on a Tuesday. I think I need to Mayday, but what would I say? How come I messed up so bad in the first place? I blame it on the stars, I blame it on the rain. I am saying your name. I blame it on the stars, I blame it on the rain. I am saying your name. I've been dreaming with my eyes wide open. Now
turns. Why do I turn into a shoegazer? Wise up, buy her a cup, and just once be a trailblazer. So I do, I even get her too. We'll make her sugar, she takes it. Who knew? New friend, let's meet again. When do I pretend to be cool when my heart is racing? It's 10 seconds of courage. It's a brief moment of faith, and so with your heart out, go on and on about your money and your fancy cars. You give it your best shot, throw in all you got. It's just a waste of time. She's with me. Spotlight feels alright. Flying higher than a Wayne mankind. She smiles and tangled rounds. For a love you would walk 1,000 miles. Just a brief 10 seconds, hope and God. So leave your heart out, go on and on about your money and your fancy cars. You give it your best shot, throw in all you got. It's just a waste of time, 'cause she's with me.
Always lost about something. Who knows if I can find a track that could lead me back to those days when we were happy. We said we would never give up. I feel so lost and confused. Tell me why we have to hit the ground when it's easier to fly higher, 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 higher. Why don't go near me. I surrender, 'cause I can take no more. Hear my last goodbye. I am running towards the end of time at the speed of light. Can't take one more fight. All the feelings that I have inside make me lose my mind. But it feels so good, though it hurts so bad. Like a drug to drive me crazy. Hear my last goodbye. I am running towards the end of time at the speed of light. Change. You want me to change. Lost in a land of confusion. This is more than I can take. Wish we could stay unbroken. One moment, one reason. After all, our hearts kept on bleeding. We just can't deny it. Forced to tears, face to fear of losing you. I want you to see this is more than a lie. You want me to think that I can do much better. Stop making a scene, because there is no turning back. So please don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Stop making a scene, because there is no turning back. So please don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridge. Don't burn down the bridges. Don't burn down the bridge. I don't know you anymore. It's been a long time since I did. Something is tearing us apart. I don't know what it is, so please just let me know where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will go. I don't know about you, babe, but I just wanna know what you've been up to lately. You seem to avoid me. Don't think you can keep messing with my heart. Are we gonna be alright? Please just let me know where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will go. Where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will go. Where will I go if you decide to leave me? Can't stand being alone, so please just stay. You're killing me. Where the wind will blow. I don't know for sure, but if you go, I'll follow you wherever you will
over, I will guide you home. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life. I've been told that time will heal all our wounds and our sorrows too. No more clouds, no more rain. I need sun to ease my pain. Before this night is over, I will guide you home. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life. All this time you thought we'd never pay the price. In the game of love, you have to roll the dice. My heart got 7 years to life. 7 years to life.
Yeah. I don't wanna be the girl, but I kinda need a word. Well, I'm into you. And oh, I know it's been a long time. I was on the sideline waiting for you. We could go to California or anywhere you wanna. As long as I'm with you, I'm alright. And we don't need the drama. We'll find our own nirvana. So run away with me tonight. 'Cause it feels like I'm dreaming when I'm waking up next to you. And my world
You see, I go with the wind, the places I've been, I keep them within. Holding on to a feeling so strong.
kept holding my hand as you reached for water. On the hills by the lake, you were chasing your dream. And I gave you a rose that you kept on seeing, kept on seeing.
Do you feel like you got broken into pieces by someone that you love? You love. Do you feel like you were waiting for the part when life will open the door? The door. Just let it come to you.
if you're in the dark, just let it come to ya. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. There's gonna be a right time for you, a right time for you. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya. Just let it come to ya.
Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. What all my friends said still echoes in my head. We would make the cutest couple. I didn't know you were playing, and I'm just saying you gotta weigh in. This is not something to die for. You turn your back on me, so I turn my back on you. And now we're stuck in this charade. I don't know what to do. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. You played it cool, played me for a fool, so cruel. It sure was time for a wake up. And now that I'm over it, someone's gotta pay for it. You should know I still remember every word you said. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Still the same. Oh, let me carry you. Still on my brain. I hope you feel it too. Still the same. Oh, let me carry you. Still on my brain. I hope you feel it too. You turn your back on me, so I turn my back on you. And now we're stuck in this charade. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, babe. You pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Oh, you walk the wire, you pay the price. Oh, you wipe some tears by the look in your eyes. I knew you were trouble right out of the gate. And now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late. Now you're standing here, but 2 minutes too late.
Captured in a photograph. Remember how we used to sit in the vines? Yeah, oh. And I can hear you laugh it off. You always said mistakes I left in the past. But no, I know enough to see the what one us we're over. Sooner than we're gone. And sometimes I think about it all night, staring to the streetlights, wondering
out your name. Yeah. You said you had to change your heart, that Albany just left you all the same. I could see enough to know you better up, and sometimes it hits you when it's gone. And all night I stare into that same light, reinventing our life. I wonder where we'd be if nothing would have changed. We'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame. Would we hold our ground if nothing would have changed? Would you take my name, stay here through the rain? Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? One and on the other side, parallel to our life, dreaming of a place to hide and find you in another time. Up it comes and down it goes, seeds will die before they grow. If nothing would have changed, we'd have stayed the same, never killed the flame. Would we hold our ground? If nothing would have changed, would you take my name, stay here through the rain? Would we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground? Could we hold our ground?
death on the job. I'm sick of walking this dog. It's like I live in a fog. Tonight I want something new. I feel the need to get rude. I'm tired of watching the tube. Oh, God, I need some fast relief. So, hey, baby, please, now won't you tell me you feel the same and you want someone to turn it all around and let you freak. Now it's on. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Get my dirty freak on tonight. My dirty freak on. A funny taste in my mouth. I wake up dead on the couch with the sun in my eyes. And so I go lay down on the floor, 'cause I can't take it no more. Seems like I've been here before. Oh, God, I need some fast relief. Like 3 stacks of pancakes and a day of TV. And I'm already ready to go and be gone. So come on, bring the heat on, let me know that it's on. Let's go, let's go, let's go all the way. I want you tonight, 'cause I wanna get my dirty freak on, alright. Let's go, let's go, let's
I thought I didn't need it, I found a new friend. I'll wake you tomorrow before I leave, and the song I'll be singing will be this one indeed. This is as long as we go, I know you will be alright. But somehow wherever you are, you're still in the crossfire. I will give you the world if you let me stay. Put your arms around me. If we stay here like this is the only place where I wanna be. This is as long as we go, I know you will be alright. But somehow wherever you are, you're still in the crossfire. And the chemical ghost, they will hunt you down. And you know you're gonna fall when you hit the ground. There's nothing else right now. I just know that you'll be alright. And it can't be undone. Still in the crossfire. This is as long as we go, I know you will be alright. But somehow wherever you are, you're still in the crossfire. Still in the crossfire. Still in the crossfire.
Wish that I could stay. Wish for this moment to never go away. But it's all in my mind. And though I know that there is nothing to find, you're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light. See how you've grown while you roam in the streets all alone. And all you can see, thinking about what your life came to be. You're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light. Another day, like the mothers of Brazil find their way. We're all on our own, but you're the most beautiful I've ever known. You're a beautiful sight in the summer night. And you can't put up a fight in the misty light.